CGTN, China Global Television Network.
At around 8 in the evening, I heard a loud bang. I thought it was just rain like we had witnessed earlier in the afternoon. I was alone in the house. I decided that when I finished my chores and had my dinner, I would go to bed. When I woke up, I found myself very far from my bed, buried up to my neck in mud. All around me, there was just water. I couldn't see the end of it.
A tragic story from a survivor of the May 9th Solai Dam disaster in Nakuru, Kenya, that has left over 40 dead and thousands homeless. Climate change has become very real for Africans. It has caused hundreds of deaths and cost millions in property damage in East Africa alone and brought untold suffering to hundreds of thousands across the continent. Today on Talk Africa, we look at the impact of climate change on the everyday lives of Africans and what can be done to mitigate these tragedies. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa.
I went to the mortuary. I found my mum, but not my son. There's nothing I can do for now. I can only ask God to help me.
Another sad story from a flooding victim. Now, over the last year, there have been innumerable climate-related disasters in Africa. According to Relief Web, almost every country in Africa is currently undergoing one form of natural disaster or another. This graphic here indicates the number and severity of natural disasters currently in each country across the continent. Let's now take a closer look at what exactly has happened.
All over Africa, the weather patterns have become more unpredictable, with severe drought and prolonged flooding seasons alternating between each other. In Kenya, following last year's deadly drought, which rendered 2.7 million people in need of relief assistance, this year's flooding has killed more than 150 people and displaced over 210,000, with experts anticipating more rain for months to come. Neighboring Somalia is a similar story. The overflow of the Shebele River has affected more than 500,000 people along its beaches, with more than a third of them having to be relocated. In Rwanda, landslides have killed more than 200 people in the recent months, while in 2017, landslides in Sierra Leone killed over 1,000 people. In the last few months, South Africa's weather patterns have made headlines. Cape Town narrowly pushed back day zero when the city's taps were supposed to run dry, while at the same time areas around Johannesburg and Pretoria were hit by severe storms. Some areas recorded more than a month's worth of rain in just 24 hours.
Sad scenes from around Africa in recent months. Now, to share insights on how climate change-related disasters are being handled around Africa, we're joined from Johannesburg by Steve Collins, the CEO of Africa Safari Foundation. And we are joined in studio by Dr. Alex Awiti. He's the founding director of the East Africa Institute at the Aga Khan University. Also joining me is Karen Rono, regional technical lead at Development Initiatives. You all, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Karen, you've done a lot of research in this field, so I'll start off with you, because natural disasters across Africa estimated to have caused more than 1,000 deaths in the last couple of months. More than 2 million people have been displaced. The cost of property damage is expected to be in the millions here, but we cannot blame climate change alone anymore. So who's responsible? Who's accountable when it comes to the loss of lives and the loss of property?
Thanks, Beatrice. I think when we talk about disasters and caused by natural hazards, the next question is how prepared are we? And I think that's where we start pointing fingers or starting to blame. And when we talk about preparedness, we're talking about ability to anticipate, response, and recover. And I think at the moment, with an example for Kenya, for example, based on the work that I did, you find there's a lot of money, there's financial resources for disaster preparedness. Kenya has signed to the Africa Risk Capacity, for example. There's data. So it's not a problem about money, it's not about the data, it's about the culture. So when we talk about culture, then it's about, do we have legislative systems in place? Who is in charge? Are there standard operating procedures for disaster preparedness, for example, or response? And I think that's where we start then boiling down to who to blame or where the problem is in terms of disaster.
And that is the question, though. Who is accountable for that damage and loss of life, Dr. Awiti?
Well, I guess you can apportion responsibility several ways, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we find, especially in response to these disasters, is not necessarily the early warning, because early warning usually comes. You know, the meteorological department has been all over the place saying there'll be rains expected higher than normal rains over the next few weeks. We have the famine early warning system from USGS. I think the real problem is really institutional coordination to respond to this thing. The problem is interagency coordination. Like, for instance, our country here is in shambles. There's the county government, right. There's the national government with the county commissioner, there's the police, there is the AP, there's the military, there's the presidential disaster.
But what I'm not hearing, though, from you, Dr. Awiti, and also from Karen, I'm not hearing who is accountable here. Who is accountable?
I think it is various institutions that are accountable at this point in time. It's just not necessarily going to sit in one place.
All right, let's hear the Southern African view, because, Steve, Southern African countries have had drought last year. There's been flooding in parts of Southern African region. When this happens, though, and when there's loss of life, who can we say is accountable here on that front?
Well, it's very hard, I think, to say who's accountable. We know who's been impacted on, and that's rural people. The poor are the most vulnerable in these situations. And I think depending on country by country, there's different capacity to deal with it. But and they're having to dig into their own resources to fund disaster relief, to fund disaster work. Overseas countries are also putting in food, assisting with these early warning systems. So, you know, on one level, yes, we can argue about who's accountable, but at the bottom line is people on the ground are the ones that are suffering. South Africa, I think, is more fortunate than the other countries in the region. We have some of the resources locally to be able to assist people, but Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, it's very, very difficult.
Right. So, Steve, you do mention that it varies from country to country here, and the people who are most impacted here are the people on the ground. But there are early warning systems, and the people on the ground, the citizens as well, are being told, you need to do A, B, C, D, and C. Why don't they do it?
I think because sometimes there's a mismatch between realizing that on the ground, people are so caught up into day-to-day survival, for them to be planning months and months in advance, or been told by government you must do X, Y, and Z for months and months in advance, is very difficult when they're just trying to go about their daily lives, working just to deal with the daily task of getting food in their mouths. But I think there are some places where communities are responding well and are actually taking some responsibility as well for the way they look after their land, for putting up infrastructure that would help them to capture water, for example. They know that that's for their own good, and they're taking the initiative. They're not waiting for government to come and say, we see a drought. I think we must assume, certainly in Southern Africa, there's going to be droughts. There have always been droughts.
Right.
And the demand for water has increased exponentially. Yeah.
Karen, you did mention, of course, that there is the African risk capacity. So the budgets are there for dealing with the aftermaths of disasters. In Kenya, for instance, the government did set aside 2.5 billion shillings, which is about $250 million US, though, for its flooding situation there. But it does seem that capacity is there, the budgets are there, but there is no implementation.
Yes, and I think partly with what Alex had mentioned, actually, is the coordination, which is often lacking in government. You'd find various government agencies. So one is responsible for drought, the Ministry of Water on floods, and that lack of coordination hampers early response and quick response. And so it becomes a bit ad hoc, if that's the word I'd use, and becomes much more reactive than proactive. So in as much as there's information, there's no coordination really, and it's all about who's available, can we do something, can the Red Cross help? But it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
Are all these institutions, because you've mentioned quite a number of them, mm-hmm. Kenya has many disaster management departments, mm-hmm. water resources, are they effective?
Wow, that's a good question. In terms of effectiveness, in terms of saving lives, I wouldn't think so, because we still lose people. We still lose people to drought and things which are avoidable, even the slow onset. So I would say yes, the efforts, but I don't think if it's saving lives, and that's the ultimate reason for disaster preparedness, then it is not effective.
Right. Dr. Witi, your take?
I think in many ways we can check the boxes in terms of the legislation, the policy and all of that, but these are just shells. They're just not in real sense designed to actually respond to disaster. For instance, we've seen many times when other external agencies, relief agencies have to come, like the National Red Cross Commission, for instance, with Kenya for Kenyans. We've seen the Solai disaster, for instance. Kenyans are raising money to support each other. How is the 2.5 billion set aside by the government being spent? And I guess it's really tragic, because what we've heard from the last couple of weeks is that the money that was supposed to go as relief for the flood victims will not be disbursed until end of June. And so you wonder, why is this money sitting there, and why is it going to the people too little too late?
Right. Steve, do share with us some experiences, though, from your end of the continent, though. How does it work for Southern African countries? How does it work for South Africa? And what kind of institutions do you have in place there, and coping mechanisms? Are these institutions at all effective?
Well, in South Africa, we have, since the early 2000s, a whole disaster management framework and a plan that looks at issues, in particular flooding and droughts. What has been mentioned by the other guests in terms of coordination, one of its main objectives is to coordinate certainly the South African actors in how you respond, because, for example, the agriculture department needs to be involved, the Red Cross, other health institutions, infrastructure departments. So you need that coordination to respond, but you need good planning so that when a disaster comes, things are prepared. But we do need to get used to managing our water better. If we manage our water better, then we can deal with some of these issues. And that's where we need to go back towards, not responding to a disaster, but hopefully preventing it.
Right. It does seem, though, that, Dr. Awiti, that if we have the capacity and we have the institutions and we have the money, that there is a critical component that is lacking here.
I think we need to think about coordinated and joint actions in response to a whole slew of emergent disasters. Now, this is what is lacking. And I think part of our biggest problem that really compounds the scale of our disasters is that the national and the county government is still yet to coordinate their actions. They're still competitive units. Like, for instance, the governor of Nakuru was sitting in Solai. What was he doing there? What was his presence? What did it signal? Was it just solidarity and moral support, or was he sitting there as setting up a central command structure to help coordinate? But when you realize that whoever was working in there was from the central government,
right,
over whom he has no jurisdiction. So he was basically just like everybody else, a bystander, sitting there, doesn't have resources, has no capability to even direct or coordinate any actions on the ground.
And so, Karen, I do want to stay on the Kenyan situation for the moment, because you have written quite extensively on their disaster preparedness, and you do talk about there is no existing legal frameworks in place guiding Kenya's disaster preparedness. The country lacks a culture of preparedness. It is much more reactive than proactive, what we have discussed at length here. So why is this the case? What needs to be in place to prevent these disasters before they happen?
I think there are a couple of things, and Steve mentioned something that is happening in South Africa, where you start involving communities in disaster preparedness. I've seen some of this happening in the arid and semi-arid counties in northern Kenya, where you involve members of the community with 30% women representation to actually start identifying the risks, the hazards, and Solai would be one which would be identified by the communities, so that then they can engage their decision makers, they can engage their leaders to start pointing out risk areas. And that's for fast occurring disasters, of course. But I think at the end of the day, it's about the communities, because if the solutions don't come from the communities, supported by their leaders, then it becomes top-down, which is not ideal for disaster preparedness.
What legal guidelines do you think should be in place?
So at the moment, there's an NDMA Act, the National Drought Management Act, which establishes the National Drought Management Authority. What is happening at the moment also, there's a National Disaster Risk Bill, which has been tabled in Parliament. That has gone on since 1995, I think. it's gone, and I think there's a political discussion around that. So I think what I found is there's some politics behind why is the law taking so long to be in place. Are there some political incentives for not having a law? And I think that brings in the question about accountability and actually, is it speaking to the people? Is it representing the people?
Dr. Awiti, what are your thoughts particularly around that political responsibility, but also about the legal framework that do need to guide communities in making that conscious decision?
I don't think we need any more laws, but how do you go back and do the necessary amendments that then now require coordinated and joint action across institutions, and then create an accountability framework in terms of the trigger actions that should come from the community level? What should the community do when the first warning sign comes? And then go follow through those things, like an evacuation manual, for instance, an evacuation procedure, because this is a matter of life and death. You need to get the community out of the way of danger safely, and make sure that in the period that they're out from their homes and families, they have just about everything that it needs to sustain their lives, and they don't feel that they've been uprooted and will never go back to their homelands. So I guess some of this is now created in consultation with the communities, but that whole accountability framework should come from the communities on high to the head of state.
Right. Steve, in South Africa, though, even though you have mentioned that South Africa itself does have a pretty much structured system, though, what kind of legal frameworks, though, are in South Africa to ensure that whether it is the community that needs to move to higher ground, or, you know, or whether it is the government that needs to implement policies, what kind of legal frameworks are guiding that?
Well, there are some very clear legal frameworks. One, for example, that is in place is that every town, every city needs to demarcate what's called the 100-year flood line and not allow any development in some of these areas. But the truth is that it's very difficult for local government to keep enforcing removal of people that are desperate for space, certainly in the urban areas where some of these floods take place. So people will occupy the land. They know the risks. I don't think they are ignorant of the risks, but they don't have an alternative as they see it. So they will go back, and then it becomes a choice of government. Do you forcibly evict these people while there are many other priorities that you need to deal with? So I think we've got to look once again at the preventative side. We've got to find ways that people do find alternative land in the cities, that these areas are not developed, that you put in place natural infrastructure that can help mitigate the flooding, for example.
Right, and we're going to look at those alternatives in just a moment. Steve Collins, we'll leave it there, and Dr. Awiti and Karen Rono. Do stay with us. We'll return in just a moment. We are going to take a short break, and we will be coming back to look at ways of responding to disasters across Africa.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Large parts of our country have endured heavy rain since March, and unusual floods have followed, whose consequences we have seen: disruption of lives, destruction of property and infrastructure. My government will give every support in this moment of grief and difficulty, and today I also announce that an extra 1 billion shillings will be made available to the Kenya Red Cross to continue its relief work, in addition to the 1.5 billion shillings already set aside.
That was Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta talking about emergency responses in Kenya. Still with me to discuss this topic from South Africa, Steve Collins, joining us there from Johannesburg, Alex Awiti and Karen Rono still with us here in studio. Karen, you just heard what President Kenyatta said about disaster response there, and he laid out some financing that has been given out by the Kenya government. How do you think that money should be spent?
Well, it's interesting that they mentioned the 2.5. Even before I respond to that, there's a contingency fund which is by law required to be in a pot of money to respond to disasters. So I don't think that 2.5 is coming out from anywhere else except that contingency fund. But anyway, to respond to what should be done, it should be to respond, to save lives at the end of the day. If it's distributing non-food items, if it's disease outbreaks, managing the outbreak of disease, because you can be sure once there's a flood, there's cholera, there's another disease. So it's also mitigating the spread of disease. But I think ultimately that money should be saving lives.
All right, Dr. Awiti, your take.
I don't think that anybody knows how that money should be spent until we know the scale of disaster. What is the audit in terms of loss of property, loss of life, and then what should go, as Karen says, basically to deal with the immediate emergencies right now of disease, illness, etc. Then the other part of the money should be going towards rebuilding the lives of these individuals and hopefully start to construct a path of resilience when we think about the possibility of another disaster. So I think in the absence of such a methodic, well thought out approach, this money is going to be wasted. It's going to be scrambled upon. I'm happy that he's sending 1 billion to Red Cross, because I think they're more efficient at doing this. The money that the government has, which is 1.5 billion, is going to be totally wasted because the government just doesn't know how to do these things.
But should the government be sending money to the Kenya Red Cross, for instance, instead of to its own disaster fighting institutions?
Absolutely. I think it's about time that government basically understood what it can and it cannot do. Government has no capability. It does not have the resources and the experience to respond in an emergency way. It is organized in terms of discrete units of individuals sitting mainly in Nairobi, and then provincial administration people who are basically paramilitary people, who have no basis for liaison with the societies, understanding their needs, taking stock and audit of the livelihoods and the losses they faced, then to respond appropriately to reconstruct those in a methodic way.
Karen, I do want to bring in question the situation of Sierra Leone, where another warning has been issued out after the August 2017 one that killed over 1,000 people there, and they have been told that there could be a repeat of that cycle this year. What needs to be put in place?
I think the various things. I think the first one definitely is to have some standard operating procedures. So in case of the disaster, what do we need to do? Then what? Then next? And then the other one is also mobilizing of resources, financial resources. And there it goes beyond government. There's the private sector, there's the international organizations and the communities. And so that mobilization of resources needs to happen before even the disaster happens, because then we were sort of prepared to respond. And with the standard operating procedures, then it's evacuating people. If it's disease prevention, giving out vaccines, for example, that needs to happen way before. And I think the early warning information, warning people about there's a drought coming and this is what you need to do, or there's a flood coming and this is what you need to do, that can also help to get people mentally prepared.
Dr. Awiti, we are hearing, though, that there are early warning systems. It's not like the people don't know about this, and natural disasters are not confined to Africa alone, but it does seem that the effects and the severity of the impact after the effect is felt is quite deadly in Africa. Are there specific challenges unique to Africa that is, becoming a predicament in this situation?
I think this is really interesting because Mo Ibrahim just released the governance report about 3 weeks ago, and it shows a severe deterioration in government capability in terms of state capacity to just do anything, provide health, education, infrastructure, etc. Then we have a rapid population increase in Africa. There's just a lot of people in all kinds of places now spilling over into very fragile spaces as well, which is the steep slopes, floodplains of rivers, etc. And then what we have is an increasing frequency of extreme weather events associated with climate change. This is a deadly cocktail, and Africa is completely incapable of responding in the way that it should. Now, what we need to think about then is how does coordinated international humanitarian effort begin to start shoring up Africa's capacity? One is to build governance capability in terms of capacity for government to respond. Then the other thing is really a burden on African governments. How do we map our countries and then begin to realize where the disaster hotspots might be? As Stephen said, there is a flood line, a 100-year flood line. How do we understand these fragile spaces in our landscapes and make sure that we zone them appropriately and ensure that populations don't spill over in those places? And then climate change and all of its frequency, early warning just really helps. I think if we have those three pieces coming together, then we will be able to get a handle on these things. But I think at the elemental core is state capability.
Right. Steve Collins, is Africa incapable of responding in the way that it should in times of natural disasters?
Well, I hope not. I hope we're not incapable, because if we are incapable now, we need to develop the capacity, because no one else is going to save us. So I think we have to empower communities to be able to understand issues around the impact of these disasters, what causes these disasters. We have to empower them to be able to be part of mitigating that. For example, within every catchment, there should be a discussion amongst those communities about what's happening in that catchment that can either abet or help or might even cause disasters. If you've got deforestation happening in the upper catchment and there's a big rainfall over there, it impacts on everyone downstream. But if those people downstream aren't talking and they don't understand what's happening, or they're not aware that that could cause a problem, they're not going to be looking for it. So I think we need to find ways that we empower ourselves, catchment by catchment, country by country, community by community, and work as a region, because this is not a country problem. The climate and the drought doesn't stick within one boundary. Maybe you've got more resources to deal with it in one border, but the problems are regional. So we need to be talking regionally in terms of these issues.
Right.
And we need to be working on certainly water management on a regional level.
We need to be talking regionally, and we have established, though, that climate change is real. And earlier we talked about disaster management having a lot of stakeholders. So in terms of looking at the stakeholders, what can be done, though, from the community level, from the local government level, from the regional level, and from the continental level?
I think coordinate. That's what I would say. So all the coordinations seem to be good on paper. There's the Sendai framework, there's the Hyogo framework, but in practice, coordination is not working. And I see this from the community level, from the county government level, and even county government coordinating with national government. That's where the problem is. And I think with coordination comes the political will. If we don't have the political will to make disasters go away or to lose lives, I don't think we're going to save these lives.
Right. Dr. Witi, your take?
I think we should really take a long pause because there's two things that are going in completely opposite directions. One is Africa's economic growth is being lauded across the world, but Africa's capacity to deliver basic services and basic protection for citizens, especially against disasters, is going the other direction. It's deteriorating. So as Steve has said, nobody's going to do this for us. We've got to step back and start building these capabilities community by community, catchment by catchment, region by region, and stitch the entire continent in terms of an exemplary readiness capability to deal with disaster. And just like we have all of these important conversations at the AU level, this has to step up to that level and basically say, how do we coordinate across the continental scale, where we can have capabilities probably in Kenya that can be redeployed to Uganda or Tanzania or Rwanda or Burundi and vice versa, so that we actually begin to think about these problems as a continental African problem. This is an African problem, must be solved by African people.
Right. Your final thoughts from you, Steve Collins, in Johannesburg.
Well, I would agree. I think we've got to deal with the stuff at a regional level. We've even got to be thinking about food security and trade links. It's not just about people not having access to water. It's when businesses don't function or they can't function, or agriculture stops producing goods and we lose 30% of our employees. That's the livelihood impact. It's not just around water. It's how water impacts across the system. So I really hope we can find a way that we start dealing with these disasters more effectively. And planning is part of the solution, and regional coordination certainly is part of the solution.
Right, Steve Collins, we'll leave it there for the moment, as that's all we have time for this week. And thank you to my guests for joining us on the program. From South Africa, Steve Collins, CEO, African Safari, and joining me here in studio, Dr. Alex Witi, founding director of the East Africa Institute at the Aga Khan University, and Karen Rono, regional technical lead at Development Initiatives. To you all, thank you very much for being with us on Talk Africa. And remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, it's goodbye.